Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our Taiwan Studies program event for this afternoon. My name is James Lin. I am Assistant Professor of International Studies and Taiwan Studies here at the University of Washington, also Associate Chair of the Taiwan Studies program. This afternoon, we're very honored to have Bonnie Glaser join us. I'll give a brief introduction for Bonnie, even though I think her bona fides precede her. Bonnie Glaser is the Managing Director of the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific Program. She has worked at the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and U.S. policy for over 3 decades. She was previously Senior Advisor for Asia and the Director of the China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. She is also currently non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, and a Senior Associate with the Pacific Forum. Glaser holds a BA from Boston University, MA from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Her published works have appeared in academic and policy journals such as the China Quarterly, Asia Survey, International Security, Contemporary Southeast Asia, American Foreign Policy Interests, Far Eastern Economic Review, and the Korean Journal for Defense Analysis, as well as in prominent media outlets such as Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Today, we have the honor of having Bonnie speak to us about her newly published book. This is U.S. Taiwan Relations, Will China's Challenge Lead to a Crisis? Co-authored with Ryan Haas and Richard Bush, published by Brookings Press in April 2023. So we very much look forward to having Bonnie speak about her new book. Please give a warm round of applause to welcome Bonnie to Seattle and to the University of Washington.
Well, thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank the Taiwan Studies program here and Professor James Lin and his colleagues for the invitation to speak about this book, which, again, I co-authored with Richard Bush and Ryan Haas. So I'm going to start by talking about the book, and then I'm going to segue to some remarks about the just completed election in Taiwan this past Saturday and its implications. So first, why did my co-authors and I write this book? That's a bit premature. So we began by writing an op-ed, which was in response to a testimony that then Indo-Pacific Commander, Admiral Phil Davidson, gave to Congress, and this was March of 2021. And in that testimony, he warned that the risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait was growing and that a conflict was likely to take place by 2027. And we wanted to make the point that hyping the risk of conflict really benefits Beijing, and it is harmful to Taiwan. We wanted to explain our view that the PRC prefers to achieve its goal of what it calls reunification through a strategy of coercion without violence, and highlight that Taiwan faces a panoply of near-term gray zone threats from China that really deserve attention. So we wrote this op-ed and we pitched it to several prominent media outlets, but there wasn't much interest. The media was quite focused on publishing articles about the pending war in the Taiwan Strait. So we eventually published the article on npr.org. Fantastic, thank you, NPR, but it wasn't very widely read. So after that experience, we felt that much more needed to be said about what America's interests are in and with Taiwan, how U.S. policy toward Taiwan has evolved, what are the ways to strengthen Taiwan and the U.S. Taiwan relationship going forward. So we decided to write the book. And our goal was to write a short, easily accessible policy book, though I'm thrilled that it's being read at universities. And it was recently translated into Chinese and is available in Taiwan. So we hope that we will have readers here in the United States, in Taiwan, and maybe elsewhere. So our hope really is that this book provides a reminder of where our country's most important interests lie, how we've been able to protect these interests over the past decades, and what it will take to continue to protect our interests and advance them going forward. So the first issue that I want to address is, what are American interests in Taiwan? So first, Taiwan's security is critical for peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific. Taiwan really is one of the few issues that could spark a great power conflict between the United States and China, which of course are two nuclear-armed states. A war in the Taiwan Strait, or even a PRC blockade of Taiwan that doesn't involve kinetic action, would be catastrophic to the global economy. There was an article last week published by Bloomberg Economics, and they recently estimated the price tag of a Taiwan Strait war at around $10 trillion, which is equal to about 10% of global GDP. Previously, the Rhodium Group in New York forecast that a blockade without, again, any kinetic action would cost over $2 trillion. Second, the steadfastness of American support for Taiwan's security in the face of the growing threat from China serves as a source of confidence for America's security partners around the world, that the United States remains resolute in its support for its allies and partners. If the United States were to sit by while the PRC tried to take Taiwan by force, the confidence of Japan, of the Philippines, of Australia, South Korea, and even our European allies in U.S. security guarantees would likely be shattered. Moreover, if the PRC were successful in taking Taiwan by force and only paid a small price for doing so, Beijing might be emboldened to use force to solve territorial disputes with other countries. Third, the future of Taiwan is important to American values. The coming decades will see intense competition between the United States and its allies on the one hand, and China and other authoritarian states on the other hand, over global governance and the values and norms that underpin the international order. Democracy is facing challenges around the globe. If Taiwan's democracy successfully generates domestic policies to protect its freedoms and address the myriad challenges that it faces, it will set an important example, not only to the PRC, but really also to the rest of the world, about Taiwan's resilience of democratic values and about the resilience of democratic values worldwide. So finally, fourth factor, Taiwan's security and prosperity matters greatly for America's competitiveness and economic well-being. Taiwan is central to global value chains for advanced information and communications technologies. Many of America's leading firms rely on inputs from Taiwan's manufacturers to sustain their edge and lead at the innovation frontier. Deepening supply chain and R&D integration with Taiwan will help bolster U.S. innovation and defense capabilities in areas such as artificial intelligence and quantum computing. So next, I'd like to talk about the growing PRC threat to Taiwan and Beijing's strategy toward Taiwan. All PRC leaders since Mao Zedong have claimed that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. I always like to go back and cite what some of the things that prior Chinese leaders have said about Taiwan, because everybody today rightly focuses on what Xi Jinping is saying. But some people seem to believe that what Xi Jinping is saying is in some ways completely new. And it is not. There's a long tradition of Chinese leaders making harsh statements about Taiwan. So for example, Jiang Zemin warned that military action would be taken if concrete moves were used by Taiwan to become independent. Hu Jintao linked reunification with national rejuvenation in 2007 at the 17th Party Congress, when he said, and I quote, "Cross-strait reunification is a historical necessity for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation." This is quite similar to what Xi Jinping said at the 19th Party Congress in October of 2017. So Xi Jinping inherited the policy guideline of peaceful reunification and one country, two systems, and a strategy of pursuing peaceful development of cross-strait relations. And in the last 11 years that he has been in power, he has not changed that guideline or strategy. Moreover, Xi Jinping has told President Biden last November in Bali when they met 2 years ago, to November in 22, that he would do his utmost to achieve reunification peacefully and that he has not set a deadline. And this was essentially repeated along with, of course, other statements when they met at the Woodside Summit in San Francisco. But what is new and worrisome are hints that Xi Jinping's patience is wearing thin. Xi Jinping has signaled on several occasions, including in meetings with President Biden, that China cannot wait forever to reunify its country. Chinese experts say privately that Beijing continues to seek to deter Taiwan independence, but that it is also considering ways to compel Taipei to enter into negotiations on reunification. At the same time, also worrisome, China has made rapid progress in developing its military capabilities. And many observers believe that it is getting closer to be able to seize and control Taiwan militarily, though there are intense debates about whether it can do so at an acceptable cost. We should note that CIA Director Bill Burns said that Xi Jinping has instructed his armed forces to be capable of taking over Taiwan by 2027, but that he has not made a political decision to do so. In recent months, there's been growing evidence that Xi Jinping does not have a high level of confidence in the PLA's warfighting capability. Corruption at high levels of the Chinese military have led U.S. officials to conclude that it is not likely that the PRC will seek to take Taiwan by force in the next few years. I made the argument in the opinion pages of the New York Times last October that corruption in the PLA, China's economic challenges, and the poor performance of the battle-hardened Russian military in Ukraine have likely convinced Xi Jinping that the risks of an unsuccessful military adventure against Taiwan are too high, at least for the time being. So I think the confidence that I have and that I have heard from people in the Biden administration is that they are less concerned about China using force in the immediate future, so talking about the next few years. But it is uncertain as we get perhaps toward the end of the decade and into the early 2030s. It's also important to keep in mind that while there are conditions under which Beijing will use military force, it is Beijing's preference to achieve its goal of reunification through other than kinetic means. And in the book, we describe China's strategy as coercion without violence, with the objective of making Taiwan citizens feel powerless, divided, and isolated, and inducing a sense of psychological despair about Taiwan's future. Beijing's coercion strategy relies on what many people have come to call gray zone tactics, actions below the threshold of the employment of kinetic military force. The PRC's coercive tools include disinformation, cognitive warfare, economic and diplomatic pressure, cyber attacks, united front activities, legal measures, and military operations in Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Taken together, these measures comprise a systematic and unrelenting campaign to erode Taiwan's domestic cohesion and resolve. In our book, we lay out 7 hypothetical trajectories for the next decade. They're probably not comprehensive. Others could come up with even more scenarios. But I don't have time to discuss all of them in detail, but I thought I would summarize just a few of them. So there are 2 economic scenarios that we write about. The first one is called Taiwan deepens economic dependence on China. And in this scenario, Beijing solidifies its role as the economic anchor weight of China, and the costs for Taiwan's economy of being excluded from the trend of Asia's growing economic integration grow. Some industries in Taiwan begin to hollow out. Taiwan is unable to effectively diversify its supply chains and its trade away from China, and cross-strait economic links grow stronger. Debate in Washington about America's response to cross-strait economic integration intensifies in this scenario, and some advocate reducing dependence on Taiwan for semiconductors and accelerating the reshoring of chip production to the United States. Others push for strengthening the U.S. Taiwan trade relationship to incentivize Taipei to diversify its trade flows away from China. Sharper U.S. incentives or disincentives for transferring production of cutting-edge chips outside of Taiwan in this scenario put stress on the U.S. Taiwan relationship. So not a very positive scenario for Taiwan. Another scenario that we write about is a negotiated political settlement between Taiwan and the PRC. And we conclude, not surprisingly, in that scenario, that is highly unlikely in the near term. I think most people would agree that we'd have to have a different leader in China in order to see any kind of a political settlement, perhaps even a different political system in China. But this is not something that is likely in the foreseeable future. Another scenario we consider is a limited PRC military action against Taiwan, essentially aimed to bolster Beijing's red lines, to deter Taiwan from taking further steps toward de jure or legal independence, and to induce Washington to induce caution in Washington against deepening ties with Taiwan. This is a scenario worth considering, and a lot of people, I think, are thinking about various ways that the PRC could use military force in a limited way. One possibility people talk about is the seizing of one of the small islands, could be Jinmen and Matsu, which the PLA has had the capability to take for some time, or, of course, one of the other islands, maybe Penghu. Another scenario, which does not involve the use of military force, but involves non-military means, that is garnering a lot of attention in Washington, is the possibility of what we call a quarantine. So China's Coast Guard, for example, could try to stop and inspect cargo ships or divert cargo ships to a port in mainland China and say that they have to pass customs in China before those cargo ships are allowed to go to a port in Taiwan. Clearly, this would cause a major disruption to supply chains, to shipping. It would cause a spike in insurance rates for all of the companies that sail through the Taiwan Strait. And it would likely, I think, lead to a great deal of criticism of China in the international community. So once again, China has to consider the potential cost as well as the potential benefit. Would this have the consequences that they seek to produce? But I would say that this kind of quarantine scenario poses a great challenge to the United States and like-minded countries and to Taiwan. And then the last scenario that I'll mention, not again, I haven't discussed all of them that we wrote about in the book, but another scenario focuses on a conflict precipitated by a Taiwan declaration of de jure independence. Also important to consider, but I think has a very low level of probability in the foreseeable future. We also talk about a scenario in which the PRC initiates conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And my co-authors and I don't rule out that Beijing will use force, but we believe that there are many factors that will lead Xi Jinping to calculate that the potential risks of attacking Taiwan are greater than the benefits. And so I applaud the narrative that has come out of the Defense Department for the past year, or perhaps slightly less, that a military conflict in the Taiwan Strait is neither imminent nor inevitable. And I think too many people say that this conflict is inevitable, even if they think it isn't imminent. And I think that is not correct. But the key point of the exploration of these scenarios is that there isn't a single path for Taiwan, for the Taiwan Strait, or for U.S. Taiwan relations. There are numerous variables that could impact the policies of the United States, of China, and Taiwan. The dynamic of the U.S.-China-Taiwan relationship is often interactive. The decisions by leaders in all three capitals will shape the future direction of this consequential set of relationships. In the book's conclusion, my co-authors and I make several policy recommendations, and I've also written separately on this topic. So here, I will not just cite the book, but also extend upon what we have written about in the volume. The United States needs to bolster deterrence, which requires increasing the credibility of both threats and assurances. On the threat side, we have to strengthen our ability to defend Taiwan, and we have to continue to strengthen Taiwan's ability to defend itself. There is no doubt that we want the PRC to lack confidence that it can take Taiwan by force, and we want them to assume that the United States will intervene in some way if they use force against Taiwan. On the assurance side, the United States should have a clear, consistent, and credible one-China policy, and our actions should be aligned with our rhetoric. In the chapter of our book that covers the Trump presidency and the first 3 years of the Biden presidency, we catalog and analyze the key statements that were made by U.S. officials during that period. And in that period, as strengthening Taiwan's security assumed greater urgency, the U.S. implemented many diplomatic, military, and economic measures that cautioned Beijing, reassured Taiwan, and I believe lowered the risk of conflict. But at times there were statements that were made by U.S. officials that were confusing and even contradicted U.S. policy. So probably you've heard about some of these, but since we wrote about them in the book, and I think they're important, I want to cite just a few examples. So once President Biden said that the United States' commitment to respond to use of force against Taiwan is the same as the U.S. commitment to America's allies, Japan and South Korea. Of course, that is not the case. The U.S. had a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan, 1954 to 1979. Since then, we have not had an obligation to defend Taiwan. On another occasion, President Biden said that Taiwan is independent and makes its own decisions. I'm pretty sure that's the first time an American president has said Taiwan is independent. You may have heard just the other day, President Biden said, we don't support Taiwan independence. So that is our longstanding policy. Twice since assuming office, Secretary of State Blinken has referred to Taiwan as a country in testimony to Congress. So these are a few examples I would argue we actually pay a high price when these statements are said that are inconsistent with US policy. They lead Beijing to believe and confirm their belief that we are actually walking away from our one China policy, that we actually support Taiwan independence. And in my view, that makes the likelihood, or at least the possibility, of use of force by Beijing against Taiwan more likely. So it undermines deterrence. So in our book, we emphasize the importance of accuracy and consistency in US policy statements. Some of you may have seen that I just co-authored an article that was published in Foreign Affairs. It's in the current issue. My co-authors were Jessica Chun Weiss and Tom Christensen. And we advocate that a senior US official deliver a speech on US policy toward Taiwan and cross-strait relations. This is in part because the American public, I think, really does not understand what our policy is on this set of issues. And US officials, when they're asked what our one China policy is, tend to say it's the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 US-China joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. I don't know, I'm not sure many highly educated people really know what this means. Average Americans certainly don't. These are all important, of course, absolutely. But Americans need to understand why Taiwan is important to the United States, especially if we go to war. So clearly articulating American interests will also help, I believe, strengthen deterrence by making our threats and assurances more credible. So a major theme of our book is that conflict in the Taiwan Strait is not preordained. The policies of all 3 actors, Beijing, Washington, and Taipei, will determine whether peace and stability are maintained. American policymakers must remain clear in their thinking that cross-strait tensions are not simply a military contest. Shoring up defenses against a Chinese invasion is the start, but not the end of the work that needs to be done. American officials will also need to pursue ways to strengthen Taiwan's international standing, its economic competitiveness, its public health, and its confidence in its capacity to continue to serve as a model of a dynamic, democratic polity in the heart of Asia. It's not America's task to solve the differences between Taiwan and China. Rather, it is to encourage both sides to manage their differences and keep open a path, these problems, to be solved at some point in the future. So, finally, a few words about Taiwan's elections. So, as you can see on these slides, and probably most of you know, Lai Ching-te won with 40% of the vote. 60% of the voters in Taiwan voted for one of the other 2 candidates. So this is not a very strong political mandate and is quite a sharp contrast if you look over here at the votes and the percentage of votes that were cast for Tsai Ing-wen. In 2020, she won by 56% of the vote, I believe, and in 2016, she won by 57%. And of course, she had a DPP majority in the legislature, which was unprecedented for 2 terms. So she was able to work very closely with the Legislative Yuan in order to implement legislation to support her vision. And she did a lot of incredibly good work. That's going to be very, very difficult for Lai Ching-te, who faces this Legislative Yuan. The DPP lost 10 seats and now has 51 seats to the KMT's 52. The 2 independents lean blue, so that really means probably 54 for the KMT, and 8 seats that are occupied by Ko Wen-je's Taiwan People's Party. And that party will probably try to play a very pivotal role. Ko-and-je may have the ambition to be sort of a kingmaker, but it will not always align with the KMT. Issues will be negotiated on an issue-by-issue basis. There will be times that the TPP will work together with the KMT, and other times it will likely work together with the DPP. But this is a very different situation than has existed over the last 8 years. Lai Ching-te has pledged to follow in Tsai Ing-wen's footsteps, preserving the cross-strait status quo, enhancing ties with international partners, and boosting Taiwan's defense capabilities. And in his acceptance speech, Lai said that he has, again, I quote, an important responsibility to maintain peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And he pledged to act in accordance with the constitutional order of the Republic of China, which of course is Taiwan's official name. That was a statement that Tsai Ing-wen made in 2016 when she was inaugurated. And Lai offered to use exchanges to replace obstructionism and dialogue to replace confrontation. Those are quotes from his statement. Again, under the principles of dignity and parity. So this is very consistent with Tsai Ing-wen's policies. And I think it's the U.S. hope that he will continue to strengthen the foundation that Tsai Ing-wen has set on a range of issues, certainly in terms of Taiwan's policy toward mainland China, but also in the defense area. China's initial response was fairly moderate, a little bit more so than I expected, although Wang Yi's statements a day or so later were a bit tougher. The Taiwan Affairs Office spokesman reiterated Beijing's positions and really didn't issue any specific warnings. It didn't even mention Lai Ching-te by name. But he said that the elections would not change the basic landscape and development trend of cross-strait relations or impede the inevitable trend of China's reunification. I hope that Beijing will reconsider its approach to Taiwan. I hope it will revive communication with Taiwan's democratically elected government. As Secretary of State Tony Blinken stated at Davos yesterday, Beijing's policy toward Taiwan has been counterproductive. So I hope that there will be some rethinking and readjustment in Beijing's policies going forward. On the eve of Taiwan's elections, a senior U.S. official gave a briefing to reporters on background. And I just wanted to quote something that she said, because in my view, it's the clearest and most comprehensive statement of U.S. policy on cross-strait issues that we have seen to date. And she was quoting President Biden's statements to Xi Jinping in November. My guess is she was building on them a bit or elaborating on them. It's a very good statement. She said, U.S. policy toward Taiwan has not and will not change. The United States is committed to our longstanding One China policy, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. We oppose any unilateral changes to the status quo from either side. We do not support Taiwan independence. We support cross-strait dialogue, and we expect cross-strait differences to be resolved by peaceful means, free from coercion, in a manner that is acceptable to the people on both sides of the strait. We do not take a position on the ultimate resolution of cross-strait differences, provided they are resolved peacefully. U.S. focus remains on the process, not on the outcome. Although the road ahead will have many bumps and crevices, I'm cautiously optimistic that leaders in Taipei, Washington, and Beijing will navigate them with caution. After all, no party wants war, which would bring disaster to all. Thank you again.
All right. So thank you very much, Bonnie. We will now move to the Q&A portion of the talk. So those of you who are joining us online, if you're joining us on YouTube or Facebook, you can leave a comment at the bottom of the event, and you'll be able to see those questions. For now, I just want to open it up to our in-person audience, since I don't see any questions online yet. Any questions that you have for Bonnie?
Cool. Hi, Nick Monaco. I just wanted to ask, if I haven't misunderstood, I believe that all three parties have mischaracterized your comments during the campaign. So if you want to give your hot take or opinion on those events, I welcome it. But I was just curious about like a very facts-centric breakdown of like what happened, what the parties said, and if you want to add your opinions, I welcome them for sure.
What are you asking me to say?
Like what happened, you know, in terms of mischaracterizing your comments for campaigning. If
Okay.
it's too sensitive, you can pass.
Thanks, Nick.
Okay. The first question on the legislative UN. Certainly, there are many governments around the world that have had a divided executive branch and legislature. I'm at the German Marshall Fund now. I deal with a lot of European governments. They really understand what it's like to have divided government and have to build coalitions in their parliaments. So this is not new. But I think that governments will be talking, probably even more so in the future. Their offices, their representative offices in Taipei, not only to those that are in the executive branch, but also in the legislature. That's a good thing. They should also be talking to the opposition. We do that, of course, in the United States. Our AIT chair did meet with both of the candidates that did not win, and with also the KMT chair with Julie Lund. And that's something I think government should do going forward. The opposition, the role that the opposition plays in a democracy is so important. We know that in our country, and I think other democracies know that as well. It is really notable how much Tsai Ing-wen accomplished in the legislature during her time in office. And in her recent New Year's speech, she cataloged some of those achievements. And it would have been so difficult for her to have achieved as much as she did without the majority in the LY. From the U.S. point of view, one of the things we will be concerned about is future defense spending, which has increased, I believe, every year for at least the last 4 or 5 years, while Tsai Ing-wen has been in power. And of course, any major purchases from the United States are likely to be through special budgets, and those have to pass through the legislative UN. And so people in Washington want to see a demonstration of Taiwan's resolve through the development of capabilities and the expenditure of resources on Taiwan's defense. And so that has been just front and center in the U.S. Taiwan relationship for several years and will definitely continue. Regarding the question, which I will try to summarize because I could talk about this for a long time. I think that all three candidates who were running for the president in Taiwan, and I won't blame them personally because it may have been their staffs, but they tried to use various things that I wrote or said to boost support for them in the election. And I don't think that's the way a think tank scholar should be treated. I do not represent the U.S. government. Anything that I say is my own view. I was on a panel at Brookings, and Ko-Wen-je came out publicly and stated that I had said that he was the only one who could reestablish communication channels between Beijing and Taipei. So essentially implied that I had endorsed him. When Ho Yo-i gave his briefing on his foreign policy agenda, he used a photo of me shaking hands with him in Washington. I think that was to imply that I endorsed him as well. Of course, I had no knowledge in advance that he was going to use that photo. I think that there also were some instances with the DPP. So really, I can't remember off the top of my head what they were, but all three candidates did that. I think it was when I criticized Ho Yo-i that the DPP sent somebody to the press and say she has not endorsed Ho Yo-i. But my point being, I don't think that foreigners, scholars should be exploited in that way. I unfortunately get more attention probably than most think tank experts in the United States, but I am objective. I call it as I see it. I'm willing to offer my own views, criticism, or praise for things that I think are being done right or wrong. When people portray me as somebody who is supportive of a particular party, that is clearly not true. I support what I think is going to preserve peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, and probably support American interests first. So that's sort of, I guess, my short answer to that. But I don't expect that it will change, in part because Taiwan puts so much stock in the United States and in Americans that there is a tendency to exaggerate the importance and influence of individuals.
Bonnie and I were talking about this at lunch, and if I could put just a slightly positive spin on a rather unfortunate series of events, I do think that it is something that is unique about Taiwanese democracy, that experts still have, are still respected in presidential campaigns. And I cannot imagine any think tank expert being cited in the presidential debates currently going on in the Iowa caucus, anything like that. So very, very small silver lining to an otherwise troubling series of events. I saw Benson had a hand up, and then David.
Yeah. Benson Gordon, master's student in the China Studies and officially Taiwan Studies program. In the book, you talk a lot about the robust relationship, unofficial relationship that the U.S. shares with Taiwan. Towards the end of it, you even talk about how one of the keys to popping Beijing's narrative that Taiwan is lonely without friends is to strengthen that relationship even further, to broaden it, to deepen it, to enhance it. But as you brought up, you've also written in Foreign Affairs about the need of assurances in deterrence. So to what extent can we broaden and deepen our unofficial relationship with Taiwan before we cross over the line where we have broken our assurance or our promise to Beijing that this is solely an unofficial relationship, and that we are not dealing with Taiwan as we would with another state?
So, David Bachman, Peaceful Faculty. So in the book, you and your co-authors say on page 8 that the U.S. is at its best in supporting Taiwan when it is resolute, disciplined, self-assured, and steady. Sort of picking up perhaps on James' point, what do you think the odds are that the United States will be resolute, disciplined, self-assured, and steady over the next 4 years in its Taiwan policy or anything else?
Well, I think I will start with the second question first. The United States has been resolute under President Biden. I don't think that it has been disciplined. And I would say probably not steady because there's been inconsistency. And I think that some of that has been corrected. And perhaps under a second Biden term, there would be more discipline. But even under President Biden, just haven't done what I believe is a stellar job. When President Trump was in office, he tried to use Taiwan as a card against Beijing. He tried to say that he would not adhere to the U.S. One China policy unless Beijing did what he wanted them to do, which was to essentially fix the bilateral trade deficit. And then when the Chinese made it clear that all of the dialogue between the United States and China would be frozen until he accepted the one China policy, President Trump then had to backpedal, and in a phone call to Xi Jinping, he had to state that he would stick to the one China policy. After that, I think he was very concerned about the possibility that something that the United States was doing with Taiwan would undermine his ability to achieve a trade deal with China. So he tried to use Taiwan to get leverage, and then it didn't work. And then he seemed almost ready to throw Taiwan under the bus. So I don't know what lessons he's drawn from all of this. Would he, if he's reelected, will he pick up where he left off? Hopefully he will have absorbed some of the lessons from his first 4 years, but we don't know. I worry about the fact that that he accords very little importance to Taiwan. And you probably have seen, if you haven't read John Bolton's book, the reference to what Bolton said in that volume, that President Trump on more than one occasion pointed to his big resolute desk and said, "This is China," and then picked up a Sharpie pen and said, and the tip of the Sharpie pen is Taiwan. The point being that, of course, China is really consequential to American interests. And he seemed to believe that Taiwan was not. That worries me a great deal. And people in China, if there is one thing that they do like about Donald Trump, it is that he is transactional, and they might seek to cut some kind of a deal. And that worries me greatly. The question on the unofficial relationship. The United States has never clearly defined what an unofficial relationship is with Taiwan. So US officials can say with some degree of credibility that we have an unofficial relationship with Taiwan. All of our business is conducted, I don't mean companies, but the diplomatic business work that we do is conducted through the American Institute in Taiwan. We don't have an embassy in Taiwan. We have internal guidelines about how our officials can deal with Taiwan. We've removed many of the restrictions that existed previously, but there still are some restrictions. So I think that is not, in my view, really the problem. From Beijing's point of view, the US long ago stopped, if we ever did, having an unofficial relationship with Taiwan because of the way they define it. So I would like to perhaps frame your question a little bit differently. And that is, what is it that China really fears? And in my view, it is the United States reestablishing diplomatic relations with Taiwan or restoring our mutual defense treaty with Taiwan. I believe we, as a country, regardless of who is president, we are highly unlikely to take those two steps. And if those are the two things, if we can credibly convince Beijing that we are not going to do those two things, then I think that would be an important way to assure Beijing we are really not going to violate what are their core interests. But we get to define what we will do and not do. We should not allow Beijing to define that. And nobody should interpret the need for assurances to be concessions. And I think too many people have said, oh, if we provide assurances to Beijing that the United States will be seen as weak. That is not the point. Deterrence, as I said, and as we say in this article, must be composed of both credible threats and credible assurances. That's true not just for us, but for Taiwan and for Beijing.
We have a couple questions from the online audience, and then I'll get back to our in-person audience. And of course, if the basis of the question might need to be clarified, please feel free to do that. The first one is, you said Chinese policy toward Taiwan is consistent, US policy is not consistent. Does it mean Taiwan is less important, so the US has not paid much attention to Taiwan? You can check that here if you need to see this question. Here. The second question, and I'll read that now, is, given that you oppose US diplomatic recognition of the ROC, do you also oppose the DPP asserting that the ROC is a sovereign, independent state separate from the PRC? Why or why not?
Right. So my answer to the second question is that I believe every president in Taiwan since Lee Teng-hui has said that Taiwan is an independent sovereign state. So this is not something that we are first hearing from either Lai Ching-te or Tsai Ing-wen. I think the United States does not take a position on the sovereignty of Taiwan. So we do not say that the PRC has sovereignty, of course, so we don't say that Taiwan has sovereignty. According to US policy, this is left over from the Civil War. It is left over from the events, the way in which World War II ended, and it remains to be settled in the future. Taiwan's not happy about that position, but I would be very surprised if US officials would tell leaders in Taiwan that they should not say that the ROC is an independent sovereign state. That is up to Taiwan. But there's a difference between saying it and pursuing a legal form of independence. And I think this is where the United States has problems and does not want to see any leader of Taiwan pursue a legal form of independence for Taiwan. And many of you will remember when Chen Shui-bian was president, that there was a referendum that was held that Taiwan would enter the United Nations under the name Taiwan. And that caused a lot of friction. And it was criticized by then President George W. Bush. And that's something that I think the United States worries could provoke an attack from Beijing. So I think that this is an area where I believe that the United States and Taiwan's leaders, certainly Tsai Ing-wen, and I believe also Lai Ching-te, have a shared understanding. We don't want to see Beijing given some, quote unquote justification to use force against Taiwan. And then the other question, I'm not sure that I said Chinese policy toward Taiwan is consistent. I think I said it's problematic and perhaps should be revised. I don't know if I said it's consistent. U.S. policy in some ways is more consistent. It's just our policy statements have really been inconsistent. So I should really underscore that. And I think that's clear in the book. It's mostly our statements that I think have been inconsistent, not our policy. I think actually U.S. policy has for the most part been consistent. So it really, no, it doesn't mean that Taiwan is less important. And the United States has paid enormous attention to Taiwan. So that the assumption of that question, I guess, is something that I would disagree with. The amount of attention that Taiwan is getting in the United States from our government has surged in recent years, all for good reasons. And not only in the United States, but capitals around the world. There is more attention being paid to Taiwan in the international community, especially in U.S. allies, than ever before. And I consider it to be one of the successes of the Biden administration's policies, that instead of just trying to strengthen our relationship with Taiwan, instead of limiting our engagement with our allies to supporting Taiwan's participation in the UN, which is all very important, and we continue to do that, but we're now doing much, much more. We are talking about ways that we can work together with like-minded countries to strengthen deterrence, to prevent force from being used, to signal to Beijing that there would be a price to pay if force were used against Taiwan. And to me, it's very heartening as I travel across Europe to hear from senior European officials that when they meet with Xi Jinping, that they are talking about Taiwan and warning Xi Jinping not to use force. So in my view, attention that is paid to Taiwan has increased, not only in Washington, but elsewhere, and I expect that trend will continue.
All right, we'll go back to our in-person questions. We'll do, I think the hands that were up previously was Dr. Lee, and then I think Tabitha might have had your hand up, and then Marie will get you the next round.
Okay, thank you for making many interesting points. And one of the first observations you made is that rising tension between two states is somewhat bad for Taiwan, but somewhat benefiting China. That sounds interesting, but I don't know how we can reconcile that back with the other perception in Taiwan or South Korea that rising tension between two U.S. and China is a good time for Taiwan or Korea more notice and getting more attention. In other words, if U.S. does not get supply from China, they have to buy from China, Taiwan or South Korea. So it's, in a sense, it's good for Taiwan or South Korea when there's tension between two big powers. So I don't know how to reconcile these two different observations.
So picking up on some of the threads, like the increased interest from our government in Taiwan, and along with divisions in our government branches, I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, high-level visits from U.S., especially Congress people to Taiwan, like the Nancy Pelosi visit, which I think there's a lot of nuance there that is, I think if you don't really understand the issues, it's kind of hard, I think it's hard for some people to understand how that's provocative and why, well, I'll leave my opinions out of it, but if you could talk a little bit about that, if you, what your views on that are, that'd be great.
So Tabitha, I agree with the views in Congress and President Biden's views that Congress is an equal part of our government, and the executive branch really does not have the right to dictate to our members of Congress where they go. So the real issue is when a member of Congress wants to go to Taiwan, that could lead to a very strong reaction from Beijing, even if it's completely unjustified. At least Taiwan should be fully aware of what the consequences might be, and then decide whether or not that is a visit that should take place. And in my view, it is Taiwan's responsibility to manage that challenge. And I think that when Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, and I co-authored an article in the New York Times at the time, in which we said, it was Zach Cooper and I, we said that this visit was ill-timed. We didn't say it shouldn't take place, but we thought at that moment it was not a good time. The PLA had had so much time to prepare their response, and then Nancy Pelosi got COVID. They were just very well prepared to execute a very strong response. But once the Chinese said she should not go, there was no doubt she should go. It's my view. we cannot be seen, or Taiwan also should not be seen as caving in to the demands of Beijing. So I think actually the Chinese did not handle that very well. But I think that there were lessons learned from Nancy Pelosi's visit. Some learned by Taiwan, some learned by the United States. And when it came time for the possibility of Speaker McCarthy to go to Taiwan, this was handled very differently. And in my view, was really handled well. And there was a public aspect or element of the meeting that President Tsai had with Speaker McCarthy and other members of Congress that I think signaled how strong U.S. support is for Taiwan. So I hope that that is a good model for the future. At the same time, no, the president certainly should not be instructing a member of Congress not to go. That's not his role. Questions about, yes, Dr. Lee, I think that virtually every country, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but also elsewhere, feels caught between the United States and China. So it's interesting, you emphasize the benefits to South Korea, and there have been some. There's no doubt that Korean companies are benefiting.
I'm Korean.
Right. Korean and Vietnam. Not Vietnamese companies, but Vietnam is benefiting from companies leaving the Chinese market. And Korean companies, of course, are benefiting. But I'm sure that a use of military force in the Taiwan Strait would not benefit Korea. And as you probably know, there are Koreans who are worried about the possibility that Kim Jong-un would take advantage of China using force against Taiwan to possibly use force against South Korea. So that could be a very, very dangerous scenario. And so any kind of a war in the Taiwan Strait, I don't think anybody really wants to see, and nobody would really benefit, as I said earlier. So we should be careful to not just focus on what the benefits are, because the status quo today is really not very stable. And China has made it clear that it intends to further change the status quo in its favor. That's what they did after Nancy Pelosi's visit. And there was really nothing that Taiwan or the United States could do to stop it. And I think we all worry that they will take further actions going forward to shift the status quo in Beijing's favor. So far, they've been operating their military assets up to the 24 nautical mile contiguous zone line. But they haven't been sailing ships inside that, and they have not flown their fighters, for example, in Taiwan's territorial airspace, the 12 nautical miles. They have flown a drone over some of the outlying islands, but not over Taiwan proper. These are things I worry that they might do going forward. So there are things that could happen going forward in the Taiwan Strait that would be very worrisome. And if we saw activity like I talked about earlier under the scenario of a quarantine, then Korea would be damaged as well if China is trying to divert the shipping traffic, for example, to ports in the mainland rather than in Taiwan. So I think it's a challenge for all governments how to deal with these scenarios, and it's also a challenge for all governments to, even though they increasingly understand they have a stake in the preservation of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, their willingness to say things or do things to strengthen deterrence varies tremendously. Your government, South Korea, is one of the first in 2021 to say in a joint statement with the United States that we have shared interest in the preservation of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Other governments, many of them, have said that since then. But then, of course, other governments have now gone further than that in statements and in actions. Germany sent in, I think, an education minister to Taiwan last year. So I always encourage all countries to think about what they are most comfortable with, but to come up with more ways to strengthen deterrence, because the prospects of a war in the Taiwan Strait would be so harmful to everyone that countries have the responsibility to do something to prevent that from happening. There's a whole range of things that countries could do. And so I think my hope is that countries develop a sort of range of options and then think about going forward what more they can do to strengthen deterrence.
There were two hands up from last time that I didn't get to. So Marie in the front and then all the way in the back.
Could you talk a little bit about U.S. Taiwan economic ties, and how important is Taiwan's economic role to U.S. policy compared to sort of the strategic U.S.-China sort of concern about military issues? And then if you could comment on, TSMC is building semiconductor factories in the States, and there's some problems and things like that. If you have any thoughts about how that is going, that would be really interesting to hear too.
And I will start by saying that my major focus is more on the security side, but I will dabble a bit and try to respond. Taiwan's importance economically to the United States has been significant for a very long time. Taiwan, I believe today, is our 10th largest trading partner. Ninth. I think last year maybe it was the 10th. I remember when it was the 11th. So yes, it depends. It has increased over time, and there's other statistics I should know. In terms of our agricultural trading partners, the sixth largest purchaser like agricultural goods. So a lot of data to support the fact that Taiwan's that the economic role of Taiwan in the relationship is very important, and I think it is two-way. I mean, it's not, of course, just for the United States, but also for Taiwan. But when it comes to ICT products, there's no doubt that the United States is just one of many countries that depends on Taiwan. And I believe that the growing urgency about the possibility of a military conflict in the Taiwan Strait led many people to be concerned about the fact that this fantastic, world-leading company, TSMC, had all of its capabilities in one place. And I think the United States not only wanted to begin to reshore some of our own capabilities and start producing chips again in the United States, but also wanted to ensure that the most advanced knowledge is somewhere outside of Taiwan. But the most advanced chips, which is now the 2-nanometer chips, is only being produced in China, not in the United States. That fab will produce 3-nanometer chips. And the one in Germany and Japan, of course, is not even close to that, I believe. So I tend to tell people when they emphasize the role of TSMC, that while it's very important, not, of course, just for Taiwan, but also the U.S. Taiwan relationship, that in my view, even if that didn't exist, Taiwan would be very important to the United States. We've talked about, at least in my community, the importance of the U.S. Taiwan relationship for a long time, even before everybody came to the awareness or recognition that 92% of the most advanced, chips in the world are produced in Taiwan by TSMC. So I don't like to exaggerate the importance of that aspect of our relationship, because it leads some people to think that, well, as we heard one person say, former U.S. official, that if China is going to attack Taiwan, we should destroy TSMC. That's a horrible thing to say. And that's not what we should be doing. And I think that the person who said that has a lot of goodwill toward Taiwan, but nonetheless, I don't think he really understood how damaging that kind of policy would be toward Taiwan. And I think people in Taiwan continue to worry about what the United States would do if there were a conflict when it comes to TSMC. Remember, I was visiting Taiwan about a year ago, and I was contacted by one of the fact-checker organizations, and there had been some right-wing pundit in the United States that had said that Biden had this plan to destroy Taiwan, not just TSMC. The person wanted me to provide some evidence that that wasn't true. And I said, our president has said 4 times that he will come to Taiwan's defense. What more evidence do you need? But to me, that really does underscore the concerns, the anxiety in Taiwan, not only about U.S. commitment to Taiwan in general, but also specifically about TSMC and what we would do in an event of a conflict. So I don't like overemphasizing that. But the fab that's being built in the United States, as I said, it's not the most advanced capability. It's a tiny amount of production of chips. If you look at the overall production of what TSMC is producing, including in China. So it's not intended in any way to replace what TSMC is doing. And the United States, as far as I understand, has not tried to encourage them to move more of their operations outside of Taiwan. But I think that Taiwan has recognized that by building some fabs in other countries, the United States, Germany, Japan, probably won't be too many more, that has also strengthened Taiwan's relations with really key democracies around the world. So that's part of their international space strategy. And I think that's been effective. So, but we just shouldn't really exaggerate the importance of chips in the U.S. Taiwan relationship. That's my view. There's so much more there other than the role of TSMC. Did I answer both of them? Oh, the other question about
other industries.
Can you rephrase the question for me? I don't remember.
Yeah, it was questions about, aside from the semiconductor industry, what other industries are affecting the U.S. Taiwan relationship. And there was also a second part of the question.
I thought it was about de-risking.
Yeah,
right?
the second part.
Right. Yeah, I'm not going to go into the question on industries because that's not my area of expertise. I think so far that the Biden administration has tried to take an approach to de-risking that is targeted and is primarily aimed at the sectors in China that are tied to military capabilities. I don't know whether that will hold going forward. I think there is a tendency to broaden the definition of de-risking. I don't think many people are saying anymore that we're going to have small gardens and high fences, but I don't know if there was really ever a clear definition of that anyway. So if there is anything that is moving in the direction of decoupling, which is not US policy today, then I think that that will have a profound impact on many countries around the world, and certainly would have a profound impact on Taiwan. But the Biden administration, in my view, has thought this through fairly carefully and is trying, as I said, to limit its restrictions to ways that would only have a targeted impact. But it remains to be seen whether it will stay on that path.
I think, Harley, did you just walk in? Harley, I was going to ask your question from online. If you want to ask your question in person, that'd be even better.
You can repeat my question.
No, you should ask it. I think it's easier if it comes from you. And then I'll take one more question. Okay, yeah, so Harley first, and then the second question.
So in Taiwan, so my question was about the date 2027, and in Taiwan, China has been, doing this warning for decades, for a long time, and it becomes like Taiwanese people become like a little bit tired. In fact, they just felt China buffing, right? It's not gonna happen. But in the other case, looking at Russia, Ukraine, Russia never won anything like our 2027 Ukraine. And so in this case, I don't know how concrete is this 2027, and and even for Taiwanese people, we have to only be positive, be optimistic, and but yeah, just wondering what are your thoughts about this?
Harley, you also had a second question, if I may rephrase your second question and also pose it. Harley's second question was about, Taiwan has two major parties, potentially three if you complete the TPP. What is U.S. policy with regards to how it treats the parties differently? What will happen in the transition of power? And if you could just speak briefly to that.
Because in a democratic history, no party can sustain more than 2 terms. I think even U.S. probably only once in history. So it's gonna change regardless. Like one day Taiwan will have a pro-China party to be the government. And when that day comes, what can we prepare for? And what's USA's reaction gonna be?
And the second question.
Yeah, my question is this: that we have this policy for so many years, supporting Taiwan. Then what happens is that we're actually pushing China to build up their military. Now they are build up a comparable one. So if we continue this policy for years forward, that will push them to build up their military even bigger. So in the long term, is that a good thing for us?
So that last question, I think what I would say is it's really hard to come up with an alternative policy. If you think about all of the alternative policies that the United States could develop, none of them would serve the interests, I believe, of the United States. Diplomatically recognizing Taiwan, I think China would invade. If the United States were to abandon support for Taiwan, that would be a terrible outcome. So it's really difficult for me to come up with an alternative policy. And so as two of my friends, I think Ryan was the co-author of one of the article I'm thinking of with Jude Blanchette, they advocated in the pages of Foreign Affairs, kicking the can down the road. Doesn't sound like it's a good policy, but at the end of the day, it's the best we have if we consider all of the alternatives. We have to manage the situation because we cannot come up with a way to solve it. And it's not really America's to solve. And I made that point in my presentation. The question about how the United States deals with parties differently. as I said, the United States is engaging with the opposition in Taiwan and always has. Whichever country is out of power, the United States continues to have exchanges with. The DPP has a representative office in Washington, D.C., and when the KMT was in power, that office was still very active and would talk to officials in the United States, and our American Institute in Taiwan would always talk to the representatives from other parties. We do tend to concentrate, of course, our attention on the party in power because we are trying to work together with that party to advance our diplomatic, political relationship, our economic relationship, our defense relationship, and that will continue to be true. But we will never ignore the party that is out of power. You refer to the KMT as you said, probably will come back to power, but you refer to it as a pro-China party. And I want to hold out the possibility that going forward, that the KMT will begin to change how it thinks. I think it already has. There's a debate within the KMT about the 1992 consensus, about what the policy should be toward China going forward. And if the older generation that has really been in control of the KMT's policies, if they begin to retire, I think younger people within the KMT will want to come up with a new set of policies and approaches that really reflects more the views and the desires of Taiwan's people. Otherwise, they're not going to get elected. I think they know that. So I think that as in all democracies, people get tired of having one, Japan may be a bit of an exception, but having one party in power. And I think it is likely that there will be another party that will come to power. So the United States is going to continue to engage with any party. And if Hou Yu-ih had been elected, the United States would have responded in the same way in sending our AIT chair and two senior officials. This was not a policy response to the election of Lai Ching-te. It was a policy response to Taiwan's presidential election. And so I think everybody should understand that the United States attaches importance to this relationship regardless of who is in power. And then about 2027. I believe, as I said earlier, it is the United States that has really created this, what almost I will call a myth of a deadline that China will invade Taiwan before 2027. Xi Jinping has never said that. His last meeting with President Biden, apparently he said he doesn't have a deadline, and neither 2027 or 2035 is any particular are not goals for taking over Taiwan. 2027 is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PLA. And you can bet that there will be a major military parade and there will be a lot of emphasis on China's military. But I don't think there's going to be an invasion of Taiwan. And I think it is foreigners who have read so much into the importance of that date as a alleged sort of deadline for Xi Jinping. And again, I'll just cite what I said earlier is CIA Director Bill Burns' comment that this is a statement to the PLA to have the capability to take over Taiwan, not a political decision to do so. Xi Jinping has been telling the military regularly that it doesn't have advanced capabilities. It is not conducting exercises in a way that is necessary in order for them to prepare for the mission of potentially taking over Taiwan. He's clearly not happy with the corruption in the PLA. And so I think that when he said, which I believe I know the date, but can't say it, that Xi Jinping instructed the PLA to have the capability to take over Taiwan by 2027. It was his way of saying, this needs to be very serious. It's not just do better, work harder, develop the capabilities. By saying, you need to have these capabilities by the 100th year of the anniversary of the founding of the PLA, that he was signaling that this is something that the PLA must take very, very seriously. So that's my interpretation. Other people obviously have different interpretations. But nobody in Taiwan should think that Xi Jinping is bluffing. That would be a huge mistake. I believe there certainly are scenarios in which Xi Jinping would act against Taiwan militarily, even if he thought that the PLA might fail. Because if he believes that failure to take an action against Taiwan will weaken his position and undermine the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, he will have to strike against Taiwan. We should not put him in the position of making that choice.
Okay, I think that was actually a strong point to end. We are now at 5:01, so this is now the end of our events. Let's give another round of applause.